First, let me explain the history of Portugal and Spain to put everything into context. Spain and Portugal share a common past which goes back to ancient times. But after the reconquest from the northern Christian kingdom started, the path of Portugal and Spain diverged. The Count Alfonso I auto-proclaimed himself King of Portugal in 1139 and started a war which he would win later in 1143. However, a couple centuries later, in 1580, after the Portuguese king Sebastian I died in a battle without a successor, the country's paths converged again. Felipe II won the succession war, and thanks to the expansion policy as adopted by the Spanish Catholic kings in the 15th century, he would aim for the Portuguese throne. He was later recognized King of Portugal in the Portuguese Damac courts. Notwithstanding, 60 years after, in 1640, Portugal obtained their definitive independence. I would like to highlight that having had shared history, the Spanish and Portuguese people have similar cultures, lifestyle, languages, art, economies, and so on, which is why there exists a movement nowadays, which is called Iberianism. But what is Iberianism? Briefly explained, Iberianism is a pan-nationalist ideology which supports the union of all territories located in the Iberian Peninsula, which include Portugal, Spain, and Andorra. This ideology has been supported throughout history by several personalities and intellectuals such as Miguel de Unamuno, Fernando Pessoa, and Miguel Torga, in between many others. But it wasn't until very recently that political parties popped up. The most important ones are Partido Iber in Spain and Movimiento Partido Ibérico in Portugal. But first, let me explain you why we chose this topic, before getting into further detail. There are up to 820 million people in the world that either speak Spanish or Portuguese. However, Spain and Portugal have little influence in the international context. The European Union has left them out, and they do not have the importance that they deserve. In 2016, to discuss what their proposals would be for the European Parliament elections of 2019, these Iberianist parties propose a confederation of states which share common economic policies, interests, and services. The legislative and judicial power of each country would remain unchanged, but the goal would be to walk towards a political and administrative union. For example, a shared foreign affairs policy. Nowadays, there exists cooperation between the countries in certain occasions, and it clearly reflects the aim of the union of these countries. As an example, I would like to mention that Spain provides emergency services to Andorra, as well as it shares emergency services with Portugal. And now, my peers will explain in detail the economic consequences of this alliance.
Let's continue by studying some macroeconomic concepts that affect Spain's and Portugal's economy. First, let's look at the Spanish economy. Starting with the unemployment rate, it has been decreasing since 2013, but it is still one of the highest rates in the European Union. In 2013, it was 26.09%, and in 2017, 17.22%. As for the GDP, it has been increasing since 2013, going from 32.62k to 38.12k in 2017. The predictions are that it will keep increasing in the following years. Next, we have the inflation, which has had different development than the unemployment or the GDP rates. From 2013 till 2015, it was decreasing, reaching a negative 0.50% annual rate growth. In 2016 and 2017, it started increasing, reaching the maximum of these 5 years, 1.96% annual growth rate. Another important factor to consider is the labor productivity, which has been almost constant in Spain. as stayed between 0.30 and 1.50. Lastly, there's government expenditure of the GDP, which has decreased a bit since 2013, from 45.56% to 42.2% during 4 years. Spain's biggest spending is on social protection with a 16.8%, and its smallest one is housing and community amenities with a 0.48%. The other country that we have to analyze is Portugal. First, as we can see in this chart, the unemployment rate has fallen notoriously. Here we can see the comparison of the curves between the two countries. In 2013, it had an unemployment rate of 16.18%, and in 2017 it was 8.87%, almost half in 5 years. We can see in this graph that Portugal's unemployment has always been smaller than Spain's. As for the GDP, it has increased from 27.9k in 2013 to 31.9k in 2017, but we can see that the growth has been similar for both countries. Portugal's inflation rate had a completely different development than the Spanish one, because from 2013, which was a 0.27%, to 2014, which had a negative 0.28%, it decreased. But then in 2015, it increased until 2017, reaching a 1.37% annual growth rate. We can see this difference in the following chart from Spain to Portugal. Also, the labor productivity curve was slightly different because Spain's was almost constant and Portugal had ups and downs, but it started at 1.23% annual growth rate, and in 2017 they had a negative 0.58%. Here's the comparison between the two countries. Lastly, we have government spending, where we can see that Portugal spends a higher percentage of their GDP, starting at 49.94% in 2013 and ending at 44.71% in 2016. Portugal's highest spending is also in social protection with a 17.9%, and the smallest one is in environmental affairs with a 0.6%. See the comparison in the following chart. Although there are some differences, they are not too big, and some agreements could be done between the governments of both countries to create the union in an optimal way.
This union between the two countries is seen by the Iberian political parties as the only way out of the lived crisis, and to possibly make Iberia one of the world's strongest economies. And to achieve that, the following proposals were launched: the creation of an entirely new fiscal system, to restructure the government spending, to positively discriminate the border and the need areas when it comes to investment allocation, to straighten the relationships with South American countries, to make stronger monetary policies, to invest in the primary sector of activity, to recover bankrupt companies and indebted families, and the creation of the Iberian Central Bank. The Iberian Central Bank would give the peninsula the power to fight for its interests facing the European Central Bank, that way getting better help from the exterior. The bank would fiscalize and control the activity of the financial entities and would also lead the way to take another look at the used currency. So, what does all of this data mean? Taking the previous concepts and the mentioned proposals into account, we could conclude that the Iberian Peninsula as a whole would suffer a decrease in its unemployment rate, since there would be a large expansion in the labor market, combined with a bigger development of the economy and consequently more jobs. When it comes to the government spending, its percentage of the GDP would also decrease, because of the fact that the spendings would be entirely restructured, and that the GDP would be higher than it has ever been. At last, the combined GDP of Portugal and Spain would be high enough to position the peninsula at the fifth strongest economy in Europe.
However, there are some barriers that make it difficult for Iberianism to actually happen. The first and most important barrier is to determine the limits of this union between Spain and Portugal. In other words, to know how much sovereignty are both countries willing to share. This is because, as we said before, while the MPI is limited to propose a confederation of states, the political party Partido Iber wants a territorial restructuring that definitively erases all borders, as well as to unify certain ministries to create some common Iberian ministries, such as the Iberian Ministry of Environment, the Iberian Ministry of the Sea, and the Iberian Ministry of Administration, whose objective is to manage at the same level the 17 autonomous communities of Spain, the 5 major Portuguese regions, and Andorra. Another very significant barrier is that it would be almost impossible to unify the institutions of both countries, not only because of the nationalism resistance that would undoubtedly rise, but because of practical reasons, as the rules in many sectors are very different in each country. However, there are some areas where they could reach an agreement, such as to create an Iberian market of electricity, a better common fishing policy, and a tighter relationship between universities and cultural institutions in both countries. Furthermore, another major barrier is that there are many stakeholders that are interested in Spain and Portugal to remain separated. This is because sometimes it is not the governments that decide on bilateral policies, but external agents such as financial institutions and international creditors, who prefer to negotiate individually with each country to obtain greater benefits and exploit this lack of mutual dialogue. A clear example of this is the relationship of both Spain and Portugal with the European Central Bank, whose policies tend to affect both countries in the same way, but by not making a common effort, they lose a lot of influence, which often leads to a disastrous decision for both economies. However, the proposition of an Iberian central bank would allow both countries to have a lot more influence when negotiating with those external stakeholders. But how do people feel about Iberianism? According to the most recent survey, which was carried out by Real Instituto Elcano between May and June of 2016, 68% of Portuguese believe that both countries should move towards some kind of Iberian political union, and a unanimous 83% believes that both countries have common interests in international politics. However, there is still a significant percentage of people who are resistant to change and fear the changes that this Iberian Union could bring. While the Spaniards, conscious of their territorial and economic superiority, do not see Portugal as a threat but as an opportunity, Spain generates in Portuguese society the opposite effect, which is a fear of a loss of sovereignty if they manage to coordinate key issues such as taxation or the linguistic and cultural policies. Not to mention the presence of Spanish companies, which generates fear of being colonized in more than 50% of the Portuguese.